History is filled with catastrophes that reshaped human destiny: wars, plagues, revolutions, and the collapse of empires. Yet, hidden among these well-remembered tragedies is one of the most haunting and devastating episodes of Europe's medieval past. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, often remembered through its first brutal season, the Dark Winter of 1315. This catastrophe was not a brief misfortune. It marked the beginning of years of cold, unrelenting rain, ruined harvests, disease, and hunger that claimed millions of lives across Europe. For those who endured it, it must have felt like the end of the world. Yet today, it remains overshadowed by other calamities, particularly the Black Death of the 14th century. To truly grasp the magnitude of this forgotten apocalypse, we must step into the frozen, rain-soaked fields of 1315 and witness how hunger and cold brought a continent to its knees. The setting, a Europe on the edge. On the eve of 1315, Europe was experiencing what historians call the High Middle Ages. Population had surged since the year 1000, agriculture had expanded, towns had grown, and trade flourished across kingdoms. By the early 14th century, however, this prosperity had reached its limits. Europe was densely populated, with little unused farmland left to cultivate. Farmers had pushed agriculture onto marginal lands, hillsides, wetlands, and thin soils that were far less productive than fertile river valleys. Grain reserves were minimal, and society lived harvest to harvest, with little buffer against catastrophe. This fragile balance was made worse by climate. For centuries, Europe had benefited from a medieval warm period, a relatively mild phase that allowed for longer growing seasons. But by the early 1300s, a colder and stormier climate began to settle in, a shift now recognized as the dawn of the Little Ice Age, with populations dependent on every grain harvest. Any disruption could trigger disaster. Europe, though unaware of it, was a powder keg awaiting a spark. That spark came with the rains of 1315, the endless rain. In the spring of 1315, the skies over northern Europe darkened with heavy clouds. Rain poured relentlessly, turning fertile fields into waterlogged swamps. Instead of warming, the summer remained cold and damp, with chilling winds that stunted crops and delayed growth. Grains such as wheat, rye, and barley, staples of medieval diets, could not ripen properly in the sodden fields. Hay for animals rotted before it could be cut and stored, threatening not only humans, but also livestock that depended on winter fodder. The autumn brought no relief. Rains continued to fall, washing away what little harvest could be gathered. Roads dissolved into mud, making transport with scarce food that was even more difficult. Then winter arrived, long, bitter, and merciless. Across France, England, the Low Countries, Germany, and Scandinavia, people faced shortages unlike anything they had ever seen. What had been expected as another cycle of planting and harvest turned into a nightmare of hunger and despair. Collapse of food supplies. Medieval Europe lacked the storage systems and global trade networks that we take for granted today. Food security depended entirely on local harvests, and when they failed, famine followed quickly. By the winter of 1315, bread, the essential food for peasants and nobles alike, became scarce. Grain prices skyrocketed, in some places tripling or quadrupling within weeks. Those with coin could still purchase food, though at ruinous cost, but the poor had no chance of survival, except through charity, begging, or theft. As supplies dwindled, people turned to desperate substitutes. Accounts from the period describe peasants grinding acorns, roots, and weeds into coarse, bitter bread. Horses, normally reserved for labor and war, were slaughtered for food. Dogs and cats disappeared from villages. In some regions, records hint at darker practices. Whispers of cannibalism, though difficult to prove, reflected the desperation of communities that had reached the breaking point. Animals suffered too. Without hay, cattle starved during the winter. Oxen, essential for plowing fields, perished in large numbers, threatening future agricultural productivity. The death of livestock not only meant hunger, but also the loss of leather, wool, and dairy products, compounding the misery of those years. Disease and weakness. Hunger rarely comes alone. Malnutrition weakens bodies, leaving populations vulnerable to disease. During the Great Famine, epidemics spread through weakened communities. Respiratory infections, fevers, and dysentery ravaged the hungry masses. Chroniclers of the time wrote of entire families succumbing not just to lack of food, but also to illness that their bodies could no longer resist. The shortage of fodder meant livestock were also weakened, making them susceptible to disease outbreaks. With fewer animals and weakened humans, productivity collapsed further, creating a vicious cycle that prolonged the suffering. Even when food could be found, it was often of poor quality, rotting grain or spoiled meat that only worsened illness. Social breakdown. The dark winter of 1315 was not merely a natural disaster. It became a social crisis. Hunger eroded the bonds of community. In villages, theft of food became common. Markets grew tense as people fought over scarce supplies. Violence flared when grain shipments were delayed or seized by authorities. In towns and cities, bread riots broke out. Rulers struggled to maintain order, often resorting to harsh punishments against thieves and looters. Religious explanations abounded. Many believed the famine was divine punishment for sins, leading processions, fasts, and prayers for mercy. Some communities turned against supposed witches or outsiders, blaming them for the endless rains and crop failures. Such scapegoating, while less documented than during the later Black Death, still reveals the desperation of people searching for meaning in their suffering. The nobility and the poor. One of the striking features of the famine was how it exposed social inequality. Nobles and wealthy merchants were not spared from high prices, but their wealth allowed them to endure, while peasants perished in large numbers. Chroniclers describe lords tightening their grip on peasants, demanding rents and dues even as crops failed. Yet, even castles could run out of food, and the famine blurred, to some degree, the line between classes. Starvation could reach anyone, though the poor always suffered first and most. Kings and rulers attempted relief measures. Edward II of England, for example, ordered the import of grain from overseas, but bad weather and poor roads limited its distribution. In France and the Low Countries, authorities tried to regulate prices, but enforcement was difficult. The sheer scale of the crisis overwhelmed medieval governments that lacked the capacity to coordinate large-scale relief. Human desperation and stories from the time. Chroniclers provide chilling glimpses into the desperation of these years. In monasteries, monks recorded with sorrow how the poor came begging at their gates, only to be turned away when supplies ran out. In urban centers, dead bodies reportedly lay unburied in the streets, victims of hunger and cold. A Danish chronicler wrote of people eating dogs, cats, and even the flesh of executed criminals. Another account from Flanders claimed parents abandoned their children when they could no longer feed them. These stories, while perhaps exaggerated by horrified witnesses, capture the sense of society pushed to its absolute limits. The famine across Europe. Though the famine struck across much of northern Europe, its impact varied by region. England, rainfall ruined grain harvests, and chroniclers lamented how barley and oats rotted in the fields. Grain prices soared, and chronic malnutrition weakened the rural poor. France, the famine devastated the countryside, with reports of entire villages starving. King Louis X died in 1316, and some chroniclers interpreted his death as part of divine wrath. Germany and the Low Countries, with dense populations and limited farmland, these regions suffered acutely. Food riots broke out, and mortality was severe. Scandinavia. Short growing seasons became even shorter under cold rains, and famine swept through Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Southern Europe fared somewhat better, as Mediterranean climates were less affected by the rains, though trade disruptions still spread hardship. The toll of death. Estimating medieval mortality is always difficult, but historians generally agree that the Great Famine killed between 10 and 25% of the population in some regions. Across Europe, millions perished over the course of 1315 to 1317. For many survivors, the famine left lasting scars. Children born during these years were often smaller and weaker due to malnutrition in the womb. Entire villages disappeared, either from death or abandonment. The famine did not strike with the suddenness of the Black Death, but with a slow, grinding cruelty. Hunger gnawed for months, rain fell for seasons, and cold lingered for years. The memory of these losses haunted communities long afterward, shaping their fears and their sense of vulnerability. The aftermath and lingering effects. By 1318, the rains finally eased and harvest began to recover. Yet, the famine left behind a continent weakened and shaken. Populations had been cut down, agricultural systems disrupted, and faith and stability shattered. Europe entered a period of demographic stagnation. Growth slowed, and societies became more fragile in the face of future disasters. In retrospect, the Great Famine foreshadowed greater catastrophes to come. Barely 3 decades later, the Black Death would sweep across Europe, exploiting a population already weakened by decades of food insecurity and recurring famines. Some historians argue that the famine of 1315 prepared the psychological ground for the apocalyptic visions of the mid-14th century, when death seemed to strike again and again without mercy. Why it was forgotten? Why does the famine of 1315 remain so little remembered compared to the Black Death? Part of the reason lies in its nature. Famine is slow, invisible, and spread out over years. There are no dramatic images of plague doctors, no single catastrophic year horror. Instead, famine grinds down its victims quietly, village by village, family by family. Chroniclers recorded it, but later generations remembered the more spectacular disasters of war and pestilence. Yet, in sheer scale of suffering, the Great Famine was among the deadliest crises Europe had faced in centuries. Lessons from the Dark Winter. The Dark Winter of 1315 teaches us several lessons about human vulnerability. First, it reminds us how dependent societies are on stable climates. A few years of abnormal weather were enough to unravel centuries of progress. Second, it reveals the limits of medieval economies, which lacked the means to transport food efficiently or store surplus against disaster. Finally, it shows the resilience and fragility of human communities. Many endured and rebuilt, but countless others vanished forever. In our modern world, with global supply chains and scientific agriculture, it is tempting to believe we are immune to such calamities. Yet climate instability, war, and economic disruption continue to threaten food security even today. The famine of 1315 is not just a medieval story. It is a warning that hunger and cold remain timeless forces capable of humbling civilizations. The Dark Winter of 1315 was not just a season of bad weather. It was the beginning of Europe's forgotten apocalypse. Hunger stalked the land, rain drowned the fields, cold withered the harvest, and death crept into every village and town. For those who lived through it, the famine must have felt like divine judgment, the end of days itself. Millions perished, millions more were scarred for life, and Europe entered a century of turmoil that would culminate in even greater disasters. Though overshadowed in memory by the Black Death, the Great Famine deserves recognition as one of the most profound tragedies in European history. It was a time when hunger and cold ruled, when human beings discovered the terrifying fragility of their world, and when survival itself became the only dream. To forget it is to forget how close humanity has always lived to the edge of catastrophe, and how easily the balance can be lost.